Le temps est venu d'arrêter la guerre, les bombardements à Gaza, les massacres et les populations en fuite. Le temps est venu car l'urgence est partout. Le temps de la paix est venu, car nous sommes à quelques instants de ne plus pouvoir la saisir.
Time for peace is not what Benjamin Netanyahu wants to hear as he seeks to eradicate militant group Hamas for its 2023 attack on Israel. But leaders of France, Canada, Australia, the UK and others have decided after the UN declared genocide and famine in Gaza that enough is enough. They want to use Palestinian recognition to pressure both Israel and the US to end the war. Here in Taiwan, where 12 of 193 countries recognize it as a state, the question is whether the coordinated threat of recognizing Taiwan, should China use force against it, deter Beijing now from attempting a future invasion. This is not as radical as you may think. Many forget the conditions attached to Washington's recognition of China. This is the Taiwan Relations Act of 1979. The United States' decision to establish diplomatic relations with the PRC rests upon the expectation that the future of Taiwan will be determined by peaceful means. But has China made recognition of Taiwan so taboo that the world is too scared to warn Beijing of the consequences already written into their different laws and policies? Hello and welcome to Taiwan Talks. I'm Ian Kavat. To discuss these stories and more, we're joined from Long Island, New York, Julian Koo, Hofstra University Faculty Director of International Programs, and in the studio, Liu Dehai, National Zhengzhou University College of International Affairs Adjunct Distinguished Professor, and John Eastwood, Eiger Law Firm Managing Partner. A very warm welcome to both of you in the studio and also Julian online. Now, such is China's global fear-mongering that I have to make a very clear disclaimer for this show. We're not discussing recognition of Taiwan now, but rather recognition only as a consequence of any future attack by China. John, let me come to you first. How powerful would you say this threat of deterrence could be against China?
In most views, the idea of there being an international community recognizing Taiwan, that was considered a red line. But if China tries and fails, that is catastrophic. I mean, domestically within China, that's catastrophic. I mean, Xi Jinping goes from being a guy whose statue would be on every street corner to being categorized with the folks in the Qing dynasty that lost the Opium Wars or the Boxer Rebellion or something like that. Nobody really wants that. I don't think, and if you look at, in terms of a deterrence, the whole reason the international community has essentially agreed that Taiwan is not officially recognized as a state, a lot of that comes out of this kind of deterrence, out of this desire that, well, if we do this, then the deal is that China doesn't attack and that we maintain peace and that there will eventually be a peaceful resolution. And if that is taken off the table by China attacking, then really, all bets are off. All the international community can do whatever they want to do.
Let me bring Julian in from New York.
I'm not sure how much of a deterrence. I would have said 3 years ago that if there's a wide recognition of Taiwan as a state, it would deter China. But I think one thing we've learned from the Ukraine is that universal recognition of Ukraine as a state did not sufficiently deter Russia from invading Ukraine.
But what we're discussing today is something different. It's not recognizing Taiwan in advance.
Right, but I'm saying that if you recognize Taiwan in the future, it shows that even recognition is not necessarily a very valuable shield. And I guess what I'm saying is that we've learned, I think, from the Ukraine experience that statehood is not as much of a shield against invasion as you might imagine.
Let me just bring John back quickly back in there to respond to that. So what do we know that China wants to do that might be different to the situation between Russia and Ukraine? I mean, obviously we have to talk about one China.
With regards to Taiwan, I think there would be a change of status, and the idea of making them conscious perhaps of what the consequences of invading and failing one of those results would be nobody would have to follow along with this kind of weird, as people in the legal departments would call it, it's like, de jure versus de facto. In fact, countries around the world have relations with Taiwan, which I think may give some pause, because the world will change if they try and fail. They can't just do a halfway measure. It can't be, it will close the door. The world reaction will be very different if they try and fail and then 20 years from now try again.
Professor Liu, so we've heard two different views there. With Julian, it really wouldn't make much of a difference. John is saying that it would be a huge step change and therefore something for China to think about. There's also the knee-jerk reaction when speaking to people about this idea that saying that we would recognize Taiwan if there was an attack would simply provoke China. Where does that come from? If the condition is these countries, if they were willing to, would have a coordinated effort to recognize Taiwan only if there is force used against Taiwan. So how does that provoke China into doing the thing that then provokes that response?
As John just mentioned about, China already drew this red line. That means do not recognize Taiwan, and then you will be punished, or several diplomatic relations. So this is already something there. So if there were some kind of coordinated efforts against China or give some threat, I think this could have counterproductive. In reality, I'm not saying for China, but you're familiar with Chinese communists. When it comes to using the military forces, they have to be very careful. So they will make this kind of cost and benefit analysis. Because we talk about Gaza and Israel, that's so different things, because Chinese believe Taiwan is part of China. So that is why they have already learned lesson from KMT.
So what we're saying, though, in that cost-benefit
incident
analysis, if we make it very clear that there is this other cost, which, to date perhaps has not been very clearly expressed to China. I think that's the argument of this concept. Let's go to the next question. We showed at the top of the show how this condition of peace is clearly written into US law, and we'll show it again here. And in fact, the US's One China policy itself is also guided by the foundational Taiwan Relations Act, making a double reference to peace as the foundation of US recognition of China over Taiwan. And that China recognition rests, quote, upon the expectation that the future of Taiwan will be determined by peaceful means. Many US allies use the same wording for their One China policies. Let me go to Julian again online. So Julian, you're an international law expert. So that kind of wording written into US law, what does it actually mean could happen if, therefore, there was war?
So I think this is a very important domestically within the US, and it's a way to sort of focus and shape U.S. policy so that all the government entities within the U.S. are sort of committed to this long-term policy, and it has been successful in keeping the U.S. basically on the same page throughout many different presidential administrations. And so I think this is the right approach, which is that the U.S. Is not going to take a strong position on whether Taiwan is a state or not. As long as, and we expect that any resolution of the question is going to be settled peacefully, and the U.S. will actually further give Taiwan support and ability to defend itself.
But that is the kind of language that we use in general. We expect that, countries should be peaceful. But what I'm asking is, what we showed is that the TRA says recognition of China rests on the expectation that Taiwan's future will be determined by peaceful means. Does that make it clear that if war broke out, then the US doesn't recognize China or can then recognize Taiwan?
Well, I think it's true that it does reflect an implicit agreement, the deal that we're talking about, that essentially the U.S. no longer, at the time, it was no longer recognized the Republic of China in exchange for the promise that whatever happens will be resolved peacefully. And so therefore, if China uses force, then whatever implicit agreement that the U.S. had to recognize the PRC is no longer there. So I think that's fair to say that it's a condition. It's not a legal agreement. It's not like China ever accepted this as a condition of reestablishing relations with the United States, but it is something that guides U.S. law and how the U.S. would approach the problem.
John, so every time we hear Xi Jinping and the PRC say that they will not rule out force to reunify with Taiwan, why shouldn't the US also say, well, are you sure about that? Because based on the TRA, there is this, as Julian has just described, there is a possibility then that we could recognize Taiwan.
I think there's a good reason to believe that any kind of use of force by China would be earth-shattering and profoundly disruptive and cause instant changes all throughout U.S. decision-making about the sacred, red lines that they've had not crossed ever before. And if the red line is no longer there, then why would the U.S. be bound by it? If China says, well, we're attacking anyway, then why would anyone else feel restricted? As it is, the U.S. has a massive amount of trade and interaction with Taiwan. Japan does, Korea does, the Philippines do, other countries do, all within this region, none of which Beijing has particularly reached out to be friends with lately. There's constant clashes with all of those neighbors. And so those neighbors may also well change.
So since we are talking about statehood for Taiwan in the very specific scenario of an invasion, let's now discuss how well Taiwan meets the criteria for statehood. Firstly, there are 12 countries that recognize Taiwan. Some of those are Belize, Marshall Islands, Guatemala, Tuvalu, Paraguay, Vincent and the Grenadines, St. Kitts, and so on. And under the Montevideo Convention, which establishes the definition of statehood under international law, a state has the following 4 attributes: permanent population, defined territory, government, and capacity to enter into relations with other states. Professor Liu, let me ask you, so how does Taiwan compare, for example, to Gaza in 2 of the categories, defined territory and government?
The definition about state, territory, population is already there.
Right.
But still, other countries might not recognize Taiwan. So that is why I'm focusing on the last one. A lot of things we can take advantage of that, because the 4th essential elements for statehood in that convention, emphasizing the capacity to enter into relations with the other states. So in that case, if we have our own capacity, which is something very valuable to other countries, of course, people will treat us differently. But of course, not necessarily will be equivalent to statehood. But at least in terms of the Taiwan's presence, international community, it shows recently about semiconductors. Yeah? U.S. has to go with Taiwan and ask Taiwan to make investment, TSMC, in the United States. Even U.S. Secretary of Finance even promote Taiwan. He said 99% of advanced semiconductors are produced in Taiwan.
Okay, bringing Julian back in.
I mean, there's a technical definition of statehood which Taiwan meets, but I think the main problem is political. Palestine does not meet any of the definitions of statehood, really, except that it has wide support in the international community. And so it's kind of the mere opposite of Taiwan. So Taiwan has the technical definition, but actually very little recognition overseas. And Palestine has almost none of the characteristics that meet the definition, but has wide recognition overseas. And I think this suggests that the problem Taiwan faces is political, not legal, right? It's about convincing other countries to take Taiwan seriously as an independent state. And the only real reason they don't do so, because I think as Professor Liu mentioned, there are many reasons. Everyone does trade with Taiwan. Everyone has good relations with Taiwan. The reason is only one reason. It's called China. It's China's political pressure and fear of punishment or retaliation from China. So I think that's really the only thing that's holding Taiwan back in this situation. I think pointing this out is worth doing, though, and continuing to make clear that Taiwan does meet the characteristics and that it's really purely a political limitation imposed by China will help push back against China's claim that everyone understands Taiwan is not a state, because I think this is the contrast between Taiwan and Palestine, which China does recognize as a state, is pretty dramatic.
So let's go to that now, politics and China and its political warfare. So how has China used its UN membership to isolate Taiwan? A large component is China's misrepresentation of UN Resolution 2758, passed on October 25th, 1971, which recognizes the PRC, China, as the representative of the member state, China, in the United Nations. The text says, decides to restore all its, Taiwan's rights, to the People's Republic of China and recognize representatives of its government, China's, as the only legitimate representatives to the UN, and to expel forthwith the representatives of Chiang Kai-shek from the place which they unlawfully occupy at the UN. Now, the purpose of Resolution 2758 was to address the question of which government would represent the China seat at the UN, and not to address any other issues, including issues related to Taiwan's ultimate political status. Watch this.
Yeah, exactly. And it is a tool that China has used, as you rightly point out, Congressman, in its diplomacy to make the argument that somehow Taiwan's status is illegitimate.
John, let me come to you. So I think it's fairly widely accepted that China has distorted 2758 to claim that essentially its adoption of the resolution implies acceptance of its one China principle, which basically says that PRC claims Taiwan is a part of China. But what are some of the other ways, if you can help us understand, that China has put this political pressure that Julian was mentioning, turning Taiwan recognition into something taboo? If you could cover Taiwan independence, secession, separatism.
Right. I mean, 2758 changed who was considered to represent, China within the UN. And it's a little bit like, when you get on an airplane and you find somebody sitting in your seat. And so basically what the UN essentially did was they went to Chiang Kai-shek's crew and they said, I think you're in China's seat right now. I need you to move over to 26D. And Chiang Kai-shek was unwilling to change seats, so they got the air marshal to kind of boot him out.
Professor Liu, just briefly, China, especially this year, has attempted to make the so-called return of Taiwan to China as part of the post-World War order, especially with obviously the 80th anniversary of the end of World War II. We're showing on screen the 1943 Cairo Declaration. That's the document that talked about Taiwan being handed over to the ROC, Republic of China, Taiwan, not PRC. There's the 1945 Potsdam Declaration, which simply aligns with the Cairo. And then there's the real legal treaty of the 1951 San Francisco Treaty that simply says Japan will give up Taiwan. So how sound is China's argument to say that Taiwan returning to the PRC is part of the post-war order?
According to China's interpretation, they believe that now there's already no Republic of China. So that is why they believe China is the sole legitimate representative of China. So that's their interpretation. In reality, we are still here. We are still using the name the Republic of China. So that is why we're actually talking about those political taboo. I think it's more relevant to China's ballooning political power and economic power.
Now, to date, no arms sales have been announced by the second Trump administration. However, in his first term, he sold Taiwan more than $18 billion in weapon systems. Biden's arms sales totaled more than $8 billion, including 3 packages of military aid in the form of Presidential Drawdown Authority, totaling $1.5 billion. Taiwan and the US have also started co-producing weapons with the unveiling of the Barracuda 500 cruise missile, or a prototype of that, at the recent Taipei Defense Expo. And according to Stars and Stripes, a record number of Taiwanese troops trained at this year's Northern Strike exercise held at Lake Michigan. Julian, let me bring you back in. So we mentioned there arms sales, there's also training, there's co-production of weapons. This is all about arming Taiwan. It's all focused on the military. We also know that there's been efforts in Congress, US Congress, to talk about, coming together to warn about economic sanctions on China should it use force against Taiwan. What do you make of these kinds of methods in terms of their effectiveness against China? And then, as we have been doing, trying to consider essentially this new diplomatic warning as part of that toolbox to deter China.
So I think this is, all of these measures for bolstering Taiwan's military capacity is crucial and important and needs to continue. And I think one thing to point out is that the United States Congress has been historically much more supportive of Taiwan, actually, than U.S. presidents of different parties. And so I think Congress has been a really important force in continuing to make sure that Taiwan continues to get military weapons to defend itself. I do agree, though, that what's missing is energy in the diplomatic and political space, that the United States and its allies need to figure out a way to make it clear that there will be serious costs, not just military costs, but diplomatic and economic costs for China if it does invade Taiwan. And I think that that's starting to happen. I think part of it is pushing back on things like 2758. I think part of the problem here is that Taiwan cannot speak with a voice on the international stage, and it needs other countries to speak for it. But other countries are just never going to speak as effectively for Taiwan as Taiwan would. And I think part of the problem here is that the United States has many things to talk about, and so it's just not a priority in the way that Taiwan is for China. And so in that sort of discussions of Taiwan's status and why it needs to be recognized, it's just kind of fourth on the list of American things to talk about, and it's always first on the list of Chinese things to talk about. And so that's why always Taiwan loses out in this sort of war for attention and in the propaganda wars.
And if I could ask your opinion about that point that I was trying to get at, which is how does it make recognition of Taiwan so taboo? The way it's characterized, so-called Taiwan independence, so-called separatism, secessionism.
Yeah, I mean, I think that this is a great example. So China's just very, very, we call it on message, right? They just say the same thing again and again and again. If you just keep repeating yourself a lot again and again, and no one kind of contradicts it. I think, the United States doesn't agree, but it doesn't go out of its way to make clear it doesn't agree, and it needs to do that. And Taiwan, of course, doesn't agree. But I would say Taiwan here has a problem because domestically Taiwan is not actually totally clear about what exactly it thinks it is as well. And so part of the problem is that there's never really a clear message from Taiwan, I think, from its own government as to what exactly Taiwan thinks is the right approach to many of these questions. So the combination of sort of somewhat uncertainty and ambiguity in the United States and China being super on message and consistent is why I think China is able to distort UN 2758 and sort of pressure other countries into accepting historical narratives that aren't very accurate.
A very good point there. You're obviously talking about the different political parties within Taiwan. Let's go to the final question. So at the time of recording, the latest Gazan death toll is over 65,000. The UN has already declared genocide and famine on the territory. In the Russia-Ukraine war, reports differ, but around 300,000 could have died on both sides of the conflict. If Xi Jinping decides to take Taiwan, this country could be the next conflict zone. So Professor Liu, is it about time that we and the world tries to throw everything at deterring that outcome from happening? We need to learn the lessons from Ukraine, from Gaza, by adding that single diplomatic warning, like bolstering, as Julian said, the diplomatic side of things. How likely is it that countries could come round to this idea, do you think?
Yes, it's however you witness the tragedies in Gaza. So in that case, that we can use these cases to muster the support from the international community, and also that also tells China if China really used the force against Taiwan, it's going to be very enormous cost. So in that case, we can actually together with others to persuade China to use peaceful means. Back to the original 70s, they already talked about peaceful means. There's no need to use force against Taiwan. In particular, if China really claimed Taiwan is a part of China, why use force against the same people, if they really think so, okay? But the Gaza is different. There's different races, different religion, lots of differences. That's why they fight, all right? If they believe we are Chinese, in that case, they were not supposed to use the force against their own people, if that is true, quote unquote.
Very good point. John, final words to you.
I think that in terms of the international community, there's a frustration with war, starting with Hamas's attacks, but concluding with an absolutely brutal campaign against the Palestinian people. And people are sick of it. People are sick of it. And I think that the courage, should come out, because people should be able to speak up for peace. The countries in the world should be looking at all possible things in the toolbox to avoid an avoidable war. I don't see anything from Taiwan trying to provoke it. And I've been living here for 25 years. Between presidents from the DPP and from the KMT, nobody has made any steps towards independence.
Okay, on that note, we'll have to draw it to a close. Thank you so much, Lo Zhihai, John Eastwood, and Julian Koo from the US. If you liked our show, please search for us on YouTube, give us a thumbs up and hit subscribe to our channel. Thank you for watching the show today. Stay safe and see you next time.